So what I'm trying to do is prod and teach us how to think Christianly. Not just think as Americans, not just think as Republicans or Democrats or liberals or conservatives or rich or poor or whatever those characteristics are for you, but how do we think as Christian people? I do want to say tonight that thinking Christianly is not just thinking biblically. And this is where some people fall off their rockers, I think, to hear a preacher say that. But let me explain what I mean. The Bible does not speak with one voice. The Bible is multivalent, which means if you ask a question of the Bible, what does the Bible say about money, to use our topic for tonight? It depends on where you land as to how you're going to answer that question. From book to book, and even sometimes within a book, you get varying shades of how it feels about that topic. If you ask the Bible, if you ask the Bible, how does God feel about war? Are you in Joshua at the Battle of Jericho? You remember that? That's in there. Or are you in the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus saying, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn your left as well? And if you go with Jesus, what do you do with Joshua? You go with Joshua, what do you do with Jesus? So those are the kinds of questions that we're going to be wrestling with. Also, the Bible doesn't address everything. And the things it does address, it addresses with the worldview that was shaped 2 millennia ago. What does the Bible say about smoking? What does the Bible say about gambling? What does the Bible say about abortion? We're going to talk about that in a few weeks, y'all, in a grown-up and loving way. The word itself is not in the biblical text. What did they know about conception in the ancient world? These are things we're going to have to wrestle with. So you can't just cut and paste biblical texts and say you have a theological opinion just because you're quoting Bible, okay? And not everything that's in the Bible is Christian. However, we will start with the Bible because we believe in wisdom of the ages and we believe in Christian tradition. So we're always going to start with the Bible, but then we're going to take a step out of the Bible and say, so what? What do we do with these voices? And then we're going to bring other disciplines to bear on the matter. For example, in the midst of the pandemic, I did not have to go to the Bible to decide whether I should wear a mask or not in public or in a crowd. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. So what do? I trust science. I trust what doctors are saying. Not that I put 1,000% trust in that. Science changes by the day. But I believe in the wisdom of other traditions. And we have to integrate that thinking into what we learn from the Bible and what we think about God. So we will bring other disciplines to bear on this. Does that make sense to y'all? So I'm trying to help us all think Christianly, which is more than just quoting Bible verses, though not ignoring it. It's more than just saying, trust science. It's not that easy either. I think there are times where we should absolutely trust science, and times where the science is so in flux, it's hard to know what it is you're trusting. And that's part of the way science works, good science. So, integration is what we're after. Tonight, let's talk about money. We'll start with a good one. The Bible sees money as a spiritual issue. That's a good place to start. There are people who would suggest that the Christian gospel has nothing to say about money because money is a cultural, social issue, and the Bible cares about spiritual things. But the Christian faith and the Bible itself sees money as a spiritual reality. The law and the prophets speak about money. The wisdom literature speaks about money. They talk about loans and interest. There are places in the Jewish law where it says you should absolutely not charge interest. And you should absolutely not seek loans that charge you interest. I don't know of a single person personally today who believes that it's wrong for someone to, let's say, take out a mortgage on a home, or finds that unethical. That's one example of how just the cut and paste of the Bible doesn't work. What the Bible is for, I think, is the uplift of poor people, the uplift of vulnerable people. And predatory lending keeps poor people poor and elevates rich people. But today, if you forbid people from taking out loans with any interest, you prevent most Americans, at least, from owning a home, which is one of the most significant steps out of poverty. Does that make sense to y'all? So we have to understand the why of commands. We have to understand the moral logic behind the text. The prophet Amos talks about having fair scales and fair wages and not commodifying people. That's something we'll come back to later. How subtly are there subtle ways that we commodify people? Martin Luther King Jr. said it this way: we tend to thingify people and peoplefy things. We commodify people. How do we do that? Amos warned that. And the law and prophets say that mistreating the poor is an offense against God. I think one of the best economic critiques of all time is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. If you've not read that, you should read that. It's worth your time. I want to read you two quick texts that I think illustrate some of the moral conundrums when it comes to money. In chapter 5 of The Grapes of Wrath, the bank is coming after the farm of the Job family. They, like so many others, are working poor and they're about to lose their farm because of loans, right? So the owners are coming to take the land from the family that's been farming the land. Hear these words. Some of the owner men were kind because they hated what they had to do. Some of them were angry because they hated to be cruel. And some of them were cold because they had long ago found that one could not be an owner unless one were cold. And all of them were caught in something larger than themselves. Can I read that line again? This is what Steinbeck wants you to see. All of them were caught in something larger than themselves. Some of them hated the mathematics that drove them, and some were afraid, and some worshiped the mathematics because it provided a refuge from thought and from feeling. If a bank or a finance company owned the land, the owner man said, the bank or the company needs, wants, insists, must have, as though the bank or the company were a monster with thought and feeling, which had ensnared them. These last would take no responsibility for the banks or the companies because they were men and slaves, while the banks were machines and masters all at the same time. Some of the owner men were a little proud to be slaves to such cold and powerful masters. The owner men sat in the cars and explained, you know the land is poor, you've scrabbled at it long enough, God knows. And then I'm skipping a little further down. We're sorry, it's not us, it's the monster. The bank isn't like a man. Yes, but the bank is only made of men. No, you're wrong there, quite wrong. The bank is something else than men. It happens that every man in the bank hates what the bank does, and yet the bank does it. The bank is something more than men, I tell you. It's the monster. Men made it, but they can't control it. In what ways do we participate in things that are bigger than us? Today, you'll hear a lot of people talk about the invisible hand of the market. Right? John Smith talks about the invisible hand of the market. What is that hand? Who is that hand? And who can tell us when and why markets go up and down? Right? I want to read you one more. This is like 2 sentences. So they lost their farm. They're leaving Oklahoma to go to California on a wagon, right? But they have a tire incident, a wheel incident, and they stop to get their wheel replaced. And the guy at the wheel store is ripping them off because he knows what? They don't have any choice. This is what, I don't remember who's talking here, one of the Jode family members. I hear a businessman talking about service, and I wonder who's getting screwed. Fella in business got to lie and cheat, but he calls it something else. That's what's important. You go steal a tire, and you're a thief. But he tried to steal your $4 for a busted tire, and they call that sound business. What does it mean to steal? That's what he's asking. If you steal a tire, it's stealing. But when the tire store charges you more money than what a tire is worth, that's good business. Enterprise. These are the kinds of things that prophets talk about. And they say that our faith and our humanity has something to do with our money, and our money has something to do with our faith and our humanity. Jesus himself said that in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I'm pretty sure we could mine that one statement for a year and not fully get to the bottom of it. There is no book of the Bible, though, that talks about money more than the Gospel of Luke. And this is where I want us to do a group project tonight, both you who are online, if you will join us, and those of you in the room. All the texts that I have on the board tonight are distinctive of Luke except 2. What I mean by that is these are stories that are only in the Gospel of Luke, not in Matthew, Mark, or John, with the exception of 2, and I'll tell you what they are. What I want you to do tonight is to, one or two of you, pick one of these texts, read it. I'll give you 3 to 5 minutes to read it. And then I want you to summarize it for the room, and then say what you think your text says about money, okay? And we'll put all of you who are online in one group, and Chris will moderate that. Who wants Luke 1, 46 to 56? You all got to pick one. I'm making you.
What would you do online, please?
Okay, I'll take that one. Joy Pemberton's got that. Who wants Luke 4, 14 to 21? Greg Reed. Luke 6, 20 to 25. What's your name? Sorry. Luke 12, 13 to 34. Somebody. Luke 16, 19 to 31. This is the best one. John stole that one.
I was waiting.
Luke.
What you said?
Yes, sir.
I realize it's gonna be.
Luke 18, 18 to 27. Somebody.
I'll do it.
No. Luke 19, 1 to 10. This might be the best one. This is the most redemptive one. Feel good one.
I don't know, I've got the magnificent.
Yeah, you're pretty good. Who else? Luke 19, 11 to 27. Can you take that one, Melanie? And Luke 20, 46 to 21, 4. That's really one story. Just 6 verses.
You want the online people take that one?
Yeah, let's do the online folks do that. So Your two prompts are quickly summarize the text, so everybody knows what we're talking about, and then say what you think that text says about money. Okay? You got 3 to 5 minutes.
Sorry, I was typing. You said summarize and
Summarize the story or text. And then what do you think that text says about money? If you're online, just chat your thoughts. We're under a minute. Read fast, reflect fast, summarize fast. All right, let's go with the first text. Joy, what is your text?
All right, so my text is the Magnificat, which is where Mary goes to visit Elizabeth and when they're both pregnant and burst into song. And the first word in the song is Magnificat. That's why it's called the Magnificat in the Latin, obviously. And so what she sings about is basically the idea that in a variety of ways,
Yeah, let's speak louder for our
in a
online.
variety of ways, God is lifting up those with less power and bringing down those with more power.
Yeah.
And the filling the hungry with good things and sending the rich away empty is specifically mentioned. So
Yeah.
money is specifically mentioned. So that's the summary. And then do you want what I think it says about money?
Yeah.
next?
What do you
Okay,
think it
so-
says about money?
So as far as money, I think that a message of this is that God is consistently on the side of those with less power. In sort of any power dynamic. And in this case, it does specifically mention like the power dynamic of wealth.
Mhm.
So God being on the side of those with less of that.
Some theologians would call this the preferential option of the poor, which is to say, we like to say God doesn't choose sides. But Mary, this humble peasant virgin who's been chosen to bear the Messiah, she's been exalted and wants to magnify the Lord. And she says that what God has done in me, God longs to do for everyone. There's an exaltation, but there can't be an exaltation without a humbling as well. Maybe we could think of it in terms of Isaiah's vision, where he says, every valley will be raised and every mountain brought low. And as Joy pointed out, literally says, God has filled the hungry with good things, but sent the rich away empty-handed. It's not just that God feeds the hungry, it's that God feeds the hungry but sends the rich away empty-handed. What do we do with that? Second text, Greg, a very important text in Luke chapter 4.
Yeah, this is when Jesus begins his Galilean ministry, and he's in his hometown of Nazareth at the synagogue, and he reads from the scroll from Isaiah.
The first thing Jesus says in public in the gospel, right?
Yeah. And so that particular passage out of Isaiah is all about good news to the poor, restoring the captives, dealing with the oppressed. In their day, most of the people that fell into those categories were because of economic reasons.
Yeah.
They might be in prison because they couldn't pay their debts.
Great point.
He's also to announce the year of the Lord's favor,
That's right.
Jubilee year, which was in the Old Testament, but never, as far as we know, actually practiced, where you forgave all debts, restored lands that had been sold, and
That's exactly
everybody
right.
kind of started over fresh.
Can you imagine what it would do to our culture if we forgave debts? By the way, you don't have to forget, you don't have to imagine that to some degree. A few weeks ago, debts were forgiven, and a lot of people had a problem with that. It's we take Jesus' teaching and we make it nice and sweet, but there are real ramifications to this stuff, right? He quotes a Jubilee text, the prophet Isaiah. This is the first thing he says in public in the whole gospel. He's in his hometown. He reads this text about good news to the poor. Does he not care about the rich? Why does he specify the poor? And rolls the scroll up and says, today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Today, this is happening. Like I said earlier, both of these texts are peculiar to Luke. Luke's the only gospel that tells us anything about Mary. We would know nothing about Mary if it wasn't for the gospel of Luke. And Luke's the only one that tells us about Jesus' first sermon in Nazareth, both of which talk about money. Dero, I do know your name. Luke chapter 6.
So this is the Beatitudes, just books and books written. So,
Yeah.
He's pretty much in the same line of saying, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are the hungry, who shall be lifted. Pretty much lifting up the people who are standing in front of them, who are desiring a different social change and addressing that same thing.
Right.
But then at the end of it, you just say, but woe to the rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to the fool, for you shall be hungry. I think he's addressing the same thing that we've already discussed. He's addressing the social status of where people are and where they want to change, right?
Yeah.
But I have different feelings about the rich and the poor thing, because I believe he does side for the poor, and he wants them to come up, but he also addresses the rich. And really, when it comes down to it, it's a sense of heart. It's a place where your heart lives.
Yeah.
Because eventually rich people, not rich people, poor people do become rich. And he wants them to go there. And he also knows that, whoa, hang on, for those rich people, if your heart is changed, you'll go hungry, because eventually it'll be taken away from you. But I don't know, you gave me a tricky one.
It's a hard text, no doubt.
It is.
In Matthew, we call this text the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes are in Matthew too, right? In Matthew, though, what did I say?
2.
Matthew 5. Yeah, I'm sorry. Still in In Matthew, the first beatitude is, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah, that's a good way.
Yeah, I like that better than this.
In Luke, it's the Sermon on the Plain, not a mountain. Matthew wanted Jesus to look like the new Moses, by the way. Luke, it's on a plain. Jesus is on the same level as everybody else, which is important to Luke, social leveling. And Jesus does not say, blessed are the poor in spirit. It's not spiritualized. He says, blessed are the poor. And I'm kind of leaning in like, do you want to finish that statement? But So that's a change. I think Matthew was written before Luke, and that's something Luke changed on purpose. But not only does he change the beatitude, the blessed, Luke adds something that's not in Matthew at all, which are the woes. What do we do with the woes? Jesus doesn't just say, blessed, congratulations to the poor. Jesus says, woe, danger to the rich. And what do we do with that? By the way, one of the things we need to wrestle with is one of the major strands of Jewish thought, which you can find in the book of Deuteronomy, which is this notion of blessings and curses. There are places throughout the book of Deuteronomy where the author will say, if you do what is right, you will be blessed. And if you turn to the right or turn to the left, you'll be cursed. If you apply that theology, let me pause for a second. There is some wisdom in that theology, right? We all know some people have benefited from good choices. You reap what you sow. That's Deuteronomic thinking. We've also seen some people reap bad choices. Like, that's true. But if that is your only theological strand, then what does that mean about rich and poor people?
Well, poor people are cursed, rich people are blessed.
That's right. That God has something to do with rich people being rich and poor people being poor. Right? Jesus here is inverting traditional Jewish theology. So did his mama a few chapters earlier. Larry, Luke 12, 13 to 34. This is a uniquely Luke story.
Rich young ruler who thinks he's got it made. He's got all his crops in and he's got more than he needs. He thinks, I can rest, sit back and relax.
Yeah.
And Jesus says that to share it with who's going to have this when you die. You need to give to the poor. And he, at the end says, oops. So where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's pretty much the comment on money.
Yeah. See, Luke puts that in a different place. Luke tells a story with it about a rich farmer, a rich fool, who has more grain than he can eat. And so he says to himself, he talks to himself. I think that's part of what Jesus is trying to say in this story. I think I will build bigger barns so that I can eat, drink, and be merry. Now, I'm going to be honest with y'all. This is a parable I have a hard time with because where I come from, that is not foolish. Where I come from, storing grain is smart. It's prudent. It's wise. It's the opposite of being foolish. But why does in this parable, Jesus has God saying to the farmer, you fool? Why? Because tonight your life is required of you. You've been storing up for a future you're not going to live to see, and who knows what your dumb kids are going to do with it. So all this work that you've been putting into saving, you're a fool. You're the opposite of wise. So what does that say to us about money? Plan? Okay. Have a plan?
Yeah.
Hold it loosely.
Well,
Hold it loosely. Okay.
Well, going back to the beginning blessing, he's been blessed in order to bless. And he's basically saying it's mine.
Yeah.
I earned it.
and that's where I was trying to, I want to say the same thing. I think money in general can be blessed, it's summarized by saying, you're blessed to bless.
Yeah.
And when I meant by have a plan, I'm like, take your blessings and make sure people are blessed by it.
That's right.
So,
What is a blessing that doesn't bless?
oh, it's a whoa.
It's a whoa. That's a good way to say it. But what I don't want to soften about this story is that Jesus takes traditional wisdom, save for a rainy day, right? And turns it on its head. I don't think we should take this story and say, don't save, right? This is where we have to do good, sound theology. But he is saying you can be very, very foolish with your money by investing in a reality you will never get to see. Right? John chapter 16.
This is the unnamed rich man and Lazarus, who is a beggar and begs at the rich man's gate. Says he would be willing to eat the scraps from his table, but the rich man gives him nothing. He dies, the rich man dies, goes to place of torment, and he's able to see Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham, and says to him, send Lazarus to, give me a little drink of water to cool my tongue. And he says Abraham says the gap between us is chasms is too big to cross. And so he says, well, I've got brothers, send someone to warn them to, be a little bit more giving. And he said, Abraham says, I got the law and the prophets. And he said, well, anything else? He said, even if someone rises from the dead, they won't believe. If you ever see Godspell, this is one of my favorite parts of Godspell when they kind of reenact this. And, but it, to me, it's just basically, selfish living that ignores human need right at your doorstep. And if you do that, it's not going to go well for you eternally.
Yeah. So many fascinating things about this story. Again, so far, all of this is just in Luke. Luke's the only one that tells the story about the rich fool, and he's the only one that tells us the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You won't find this anywhere else in the Gospels. There's a lot that we don't know about this story. Like, the story says nothing about the rich man's character. Was he a good man? Was he a bad man? We can surmise. Lazarus is lying at his gate, and the dogs are licking his sores. By the way, in the Bible, when you read dogs, don't think pets. They didn't have pet dogs in the ancient world. These were scavengers, so they're treating him as already dead, right? They're licking their meal. It's graphic imagery that Jesus uses here. The rich man's dressed in purple, eats sumptuously every day, and Lazarus is lying at his gate. Notice, as John said, the rich man is not named. We know his condition. He's rich. Lazarus has a name, which is interesting. But death does what to them? Reverses. A social switch.
To me, in one thing, if we want to, it basically, to me, is talk about the prosperity gospel. Saying what we were saying earlier, that if the person who's wealthy is obviously blessed by God.
Yeah.
And this is put it in context before that. He's debating with the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And his statement is the Pharisees love money.
Right.
Because I'm sure in their way of thinking,
Money was a sign of blessing.
if you were rich, that meant you were doing you were in God's favor and you was blessing.
Right.
If you were poor, it meant the opposite.
That's right. The problem with saying that wealth is a blessing is the corollary logic, which is that poverty is a curse. If God gives wealth, then who's responsible for poverty? I think the whole part of that story, which we often miss, is the end of it, though. When the rich man says, please let Lazarus go back and tell my brothers about this reality. And Abraham says, no, they've got the law and the prophets. That's good enough. And the rich man says, no, they need somebody to rise from the dead, because if somebody comes at them from the dead, they will get it then. Which is obviously foreshadowing, right? Will they believe even if someone rises from the dead? About this great social subversion? Powerful story. Dina, chapter 18, 18 to 27.
Okay, this is another rich young ruler, maybe the same one. Who, he's the one who starts asking Jesus how to get to heaven, and he doesn't get the answer. So basically, the summary is, a rich guy says, I want to be in charge of how I go to heaven, and Jesus says, well, that's too bad, because God's in charge of how I go to heaven. And then, what I think it says about money is we think money gives us power, but it actually distorts our view of power.
I want to come back to that. That was good. So the rich man asks, by the way, this story, unlike the others, is told in the other gospels. The other synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, though they all have a different slant on it. But I included this one because it has to do with money. What must I do to inherit? That's a rich person's question, right? What must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, you know the commandments. And the guy says, yeah, I've done all that. And Jesus says, one thing you lack, sell your possessions, give to the poor, then come and follow me. Now, here's something I want you to wrestle with me tonight. When Nicodemus goes to Jesus in the Gospel of John and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says to Nicodemus, what?
Must be born from above.
You must be born again or from above. And we say that applies to all people everywhere. Right? You must be born again. That wasn't just Jesus talking to Nicodemus, that was Jesus talking to all of us. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in 3 gospels, when Jesus says to this man, sell your possessions and give to the poor and then come and follow me, we say, he was just talking to him. Why? Why do we do that? Or is Jesus talking to all of us? Does Jesus want all of us to sell our possessions and give to the poor before we follow him? And the text says the man went away sad because he had great wealth. And we're left to wonder, did he ever follow Jesus? And Jesus turns to his disciples and says, it's easier for a rich man, it's easier for a camel, which was about the largest thing they could imagine, the largest thing they had seen in Jesus' day, a camel to go through the eye of a needle, which was about the smallest thing they had ever laid eyes on, than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. To which the disciples say, well, who then can be saved? And Jesus says, it's impossible. Except for God. With God, all things are possible, which was an echo of what they said to Mary at the very beginning when she said, how? I'm a virgin. Same thing. So what does this text mean for us? What did you say, Dina?
It said that we think money gives us more power, but it actually distorts our view.
Think about this with me. We think money gives us freedom. That rich people have more freedom than poor people. In many ways, that's true. Like, I want to go to, where do I want to go?
Fayetteville.
I want to go to Paris. It's not just my time that prevents me from going to Paris. Rich people can go to Paris. Poor people can't go to Paris. Rich people have more freedom. But when Jesus comes to town and says to the poor person, hey, come follow me. And then says to the rich person, hey, come follow me. Who's really free to do it? Does money give us freedom? Or does money inhibit our freedom? which I think gets to what Dina's saying here about power. Does money give us power? Or does money rob us of power? I'll go to meddling now. What about a church where somebody gives them a $10 million gift? Does that empower the church? Absolutely, it can. We will take any $10 million gift. But what about if that person who gives that money doesn't want you talking about X? Are you free then? Or are you more constrained than you were before you received the $10 million gift? Does money liberate? Or does money constrain? Barbara Brown Taylor, one of my favorite preachers, once said, the opposite of rich is not poor. She said the opposite of rich is free. Or as one musician says, freedom's just another word for
Nothing left to lose.
nothing left to lose. That's who's really free. So, wrestle with me. Does money give freedom or does money rob you of freedom? Does money give you power or does money rob you of power? Or is there some in between like threshold place? Right?
Well, in my passage, it definitely talks about the poor people being lifted up.
Yeah.
As opposed to staying poor.
Right.
So there's definitely an emphasis on,
In uplift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly, I mean, poverty can be as constricting, can be, take freedom away.
Absolutely.
time.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're worried about where your next meal is coming from, or
That's
you're
right.
gonna have room over your head at night, that's not exactly the lifestyle anybody wants to
That's exactly right.
jump into.
That's exactly right.
yeah, as your example of who could follow Jesus better, more easily. Like, well, a poor person probably's got, an elderly parent to take care of, and no one else can do that, and they're, working 2 jobs, and their kids have to get to school, and they have to make that happen, and they can't leave either.
Right.
Uh,
For sure. Luke 19. Oh, Serenity.
It is a portion of scripture that talks about Zacchaeus, who wants to see Jesus, and he was short, so he couldn't see Jesus, and of course, he climbed the tree. And Jesus wanted to go and dine with him in his home, so he goes, and when he gets there, Zacchaeus decides to give all of, he's like, I'm gonna give half my money away, and I'm gonna pay back all, I'm gonna pay back anything that I've cheated anybody from. And Jesus says that today salvation has come to this home. And he said the Son of Man comes to seek and save the lost. And so I think what that has to say about money is that you can have the money and give it to Jesus and move forward.
Okay. So I think this is what Luke has been building to, this whole gospel. I think Zacchaeus might be the key to the whole gospel of Luke. Again, we wouldn't know Zacchaeus. He would be lost. We wouldn't know the wee little man if it wasn't for the gospel of Luke. He's not just a tax collector, a chief tax collector, which means he's in charge of the whole system of the region, right? Tax collectors often abuse their authority and they're getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, collecting taxes not for the Jewish state, but for Rome, while the people of the land are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. Jesus comes to Zacchaeus' house. Zacchaeus says, I'll start with half my possessions I'll give to the poor. And then if I've defrauded anyone anything, I'll pay it back
4 times.
4 times, reparations, right? And Jesus, when he hears Zacchaeus say that, Jesus says, today, remember, the first thing he said publicly in Nazareth, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Now, Zacchaeus, today, salvation has come to this house. Now, I want us to think about that just for a second. Zacchaeus made no profession of faith. He didn't say he didn't recite a biblical verse. He didn't say the sinner's prayer.
I
He
thought
said-
walked the aisle.
Here, he didn't walk the aisle, he climbed the tree. But he said, here's what I'm gonna do with my money, and Jesus said, salvation. A spiritual word. Salvation has come to this house.
And also notice the juxtaposition of the last one that we looked at. That rich young ruler.
That's
that
right.
happens in the chapter right before.
Yeah, that's right. How about that? MK, Melanie. This is the text that comes right after Zacchaeus.
Right after that, this is the parable of the 10 minas that Jesus told right before he entered Jerusalem. He was getting close to Jerusalem. There was a man of noble birth from a distant country that had appointed himself to be king. Upon his return, he called in 10 servants. He gave each of them a mina and told them to put that money to work until he came back. And his subjects didn't like him at all. They didn't really even want him to be their king, but he was king. And when he returned home, he sent for the servants, and one servant says, I took your mina and now here's 10 for you. And, you know, the ruler was really happy and gave him 10 cities to rule over or to reside over. And then the next servant came and says, I took your one mina, I made 5 for you, here's 5. And so that man gets 5 cities. And he's really happy, well done, my good servant thing. But then another servant came and said, sir, here's your one mina back that you gave me. I kept it laid away in a piece of cloth because I'm afraid of you, because you're a hard man. And you take out what you did not put in and you reap what you did not sow. And that made the king mad and says, I'm going to judge you by your own words because I gave you a mina and, you know, and you did nothing with it. So I'm going to take your mina away from you and give it to the guy that I've already given 10 cities to. So it's like if you're given something, you should use it.
Ah,
You shouldn't be afraid for sure.
That's
You
right.
should never be afraid. And if you're given not just money, but time, talent, gifts of any sort, don't be afraid. Disperse them out there, put them to good use in the world. Is what I get out of it. But
Doesn't this seem to be a parable about stewardship? Do we steward God's gifts to us well? What do we do? Do we bury it?
And also, you know, it's comment about the master.
mhm.
I knew you to be a hard and cruel master.
Yeah.
And, you know, so it's also, I think, the parable about our attitude toward God in this case.
Mistrust of God. If I don't trust God to give me enough, that's almost the firm foundation of generosity towards others, right? You can't ask someone who doesn't think they have enough to be generous. But the moment I trust that there will be enough, it empowers me and you to be generous at that point. So right on the heels of Jesus announcing salvation to Zacchaeus, he tells a story about what we do with our money. Finally, and this is another story, this is told in Mark, but Luke adds a special touch to it. So
There's all kinds of comments up there if you want to read or.
somebody online be the spokesperson, volunteer. Please. Somebody named Lonnie Allenball, volunteer.
I think she's,
She left.
no, she's still there, but I don't think she put her things on.
Every always in spirit. I did it. I was
Okay.
to do it, and I did it.
So at the end of chapter 20, Jesus tells the story, beware the Pharisees who like to walk around in flowing robes and they devour widows' homes. they devour widows' homes. And in the next story, chapter 21, we don't put these texts together because there's a chapter division there, so it tricks our eyes. But in the next chapter, he tells the story of who in the temple?
The widow's mite.
That's right, the widow who put in all that she had to live on. I think it's fascinating that Luke begins with a woman talking about social subversion, and ends with a story about a woman giving. This is the widow in the temple who's vulnerable because she's a widow. But in the story just before that, Jesus says, watch out for some of these temple leaders because they walk around in long robes and they like to be seen on street corners and they devour widows' homes. And in the next story, she puts in all that she has to live on, which is a question of, is this a story of beauty and sacrifice? Or is this a story of religious predation on people? That's a twist that Luke adds. That's not necessarily in Mark. She put in all. I hope that you can see that Luke cares a lot about money. And most every story that is peculiar to Luke that weren't in the other Gospels. So the stories that Luke contributed that weren't in Matthew or Mark had something to do with money. Not to mention, Luke flows into the book of Acts. Remember, that's a 2-volume set. And what does the early church do? Do y'all remember that? What does the early church do with their money?
They sell what they have and give to a common fund, and each
That's right.
shares according to their need.
They're selling fields, putting it in common property. Barnabas does that in chapter 4, sells a field, brings it. And then in the next chapter, you have Ananias and Sapphira
Sort of good, not really.
who lie about it and end up dead in the church, which is the best tithing text there is. Tithe or die, right? In other words, I think what Luke was saying is the early church took what Jesus was saying about money pretty stinking serious. Yes.
Also seems to be an overriding theme about greed, the danger of greed, because it strikes me that greed, that attitude can exist at any economic level.
That's right. That's right. That's true.
We never define what is rich. Am I rich? Are
There
you
you go.
rich? You know, who's
We're gonna
rich?
get to that.
Another thing is the possessions themselves, to think that you own anything or you possess anything is probably a false perception. Because everything we are and everything we have belongs to God, which means it belongs to everyone. And we are just the keepers of it, just like we're the keepers of this earth.
Right. So doesn't the Bible also say, naked I came from the womb and naked I will depart?
Exactly, yeah.
Or as the old preachers like to say, you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul.
Preston, what did Luke have? Was he rich? Did he have any money?
Uh,
He's a physician.
we say he was a physician.
Yeah.
By the way, none of the gospel writers identify themselves. It's by church tradition that we think we know who wrote what. Luke is a little trickier though, because there's 3 different times in Acts where the narrative says we, where Paul is traveling. And he goes from they to we departed on the ship. So it was somebody who was traveling with Paul. And the way the narrative reads, it sounds like Luke. According to church tradition, he was a physician. But again, unlike our culture, physicians weren't, rich and well-to-do in the ancient world necessarily. So it may not have anything to do with Luke's social location. It may have to do with the location of the people he's writing to. Whatever, and scholars have a lot of fun with that question, right? Why did Luke care so much about this? Why was money so dang important to Luke? We don't know exactly why. We just know that it was. Like, had something to do with salvation.
But it can be used for great good and great evil.
That's right.
It can stay in the way of you worshiping God, or it can be a tool for you to worship God.
That's right.
Money is a tricky subject,
Yeah,
and you can see it in both ways, in
that's right.
various aspects of your lives and everybody around you.
Why do we vote on a church budget in the end of a worship service?
Yeah, I picked the worst week in the world to have this conversation. We're voting on a budget on Sunday.
He traveled with Paul?
Luke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe that was an influence. Paul was an influence, man. He was pretty well off at the beginning, like a blind. Maybe influenced the thinking.
We think so. Paul was a Roman citizen. There were precious few ways that Jewish people could become Roman citizens, one of which was that they could purchase their citizenship. So some people think Paul was wealthy. Maybe that's a great, I hadn't connected those dots, but that's a great thought. Let me try to tie all this together and see if we can, again, we just quoted a lot of verses and read some stories tonight, and I'm trying to give you a whole gospel, right, about what Luke says about money. But we have to take a step out and say, so what? So what does this mean for us? You put all this in a blender. What does it mean? Let me just offer a few thoughts, and then y'all can say whatever you want to say. No, you're good. What we do with our money says something about our faith. And that sounds so simple, but there are some churches where you can't make that statement. In the Gospel of Luke, it has something to do with our salvation. Luke seems to think that if you've lost the capacity to open your hands, you've lost the capacity to receive something too. That the problem with the fist is not just that it can't give, but that it can't receive either. Luke thinks that money has something to do with salvation. Now, I'm not saying buy your salvation. I'm not selling indulgences. But I am saying that the way of Jesus and the good news of Jesus in this world has something to say to both the rich and the poor. That's worthy of our consideration. Number two, money is a wonderful tool, but a horrible master. And this is where we need some wisdom. That's not an answer. That's just wisdom for you to ponder. We always talk about what we do with our money. But let's go back to the grapes of wrath. How many times do you stop and think what money is doing to you? And this is where, y'all, I think rich people need to be saved in very real ways, just like poor people need to be saved in very real and tangible ways. Wealth can delude us into thinking we don't need anything. I don't need you. I can live in my privacy. By the way, privacy is a symptom of wealth, right? In South Africa, those of us who've been over there, they don't talk about privacy because it doesn't exist. You live in a one-room house with 10 people. You bathe outside. Same thing as the New Testament. What is privacy is only a concern for people who have wealth. And in the ancient world, they would call it deprived. Saying privacy is not something you want. You want public and common good, but we've lost that in our culture. Seldom do we stop to think about what money is doing to us. When churches become captive to the biggest givers, what does that do to a church? When your first question is how much does it cost or how much does it pay? What does that do to your soul? So yes, ask what you're doing with your money, but also ask what is your money doing to you? What's our money doing to our country? What's our money doing to rich people? What's our money doing to poor people? Being rich, number 3, being rich and being poor is contextual. Back to Greg's observation. What is it? Who's rich? I think rich people are those who have a little more than I do. That's who I call rich, right? But there are some places in the world where I'm astronomically rich. And there are some places in the world where I'm astronomically poor. So wealth is contextual. And I wonder if this isn't where the rich man and Lazarus story might give us some wisdom here. It's not just that the rich man was rich and Lazarus was poor. It's that the rich man was rich and Lazarus was poor, and he was lying right there at his gate. So there's an ethicist at Harvard. I'm not sure if he's alive or dead now. Peter Singer, Princeton, not Harvard. Y'all ever heard of Peter Singer? A few years ago, he said, consider this story. You're walking through a park that has a pond, a very shallow pond. And as you're walking, you see something splashing in the pond. And upon further observation, you see that it's a child drowning in this shallow pond. And you look around and you see no babysitter, no parent. And you realize if you don't save that child will drown. And you will survive because it's a very shallow pond. You can walk out there and get the child. And so you head that way, but on your way, you realize you're wearing your very best suit and shoes. And you realize you will probably ruin your shirt and shoes, and it will cost you hundreds of dollars to repair them. Do you save the child? How many of you would say only a vile, evil person would keep going? Raise your hands. I'm going to make you vote tonight.
Would pass by.
Would pass by, not go.
Would pass by and not save the child.
Oh, okay.
How, only a vile, evil person would keep going and not save the child. Then Peter Singer says, okay, let's apply that parable to our reality today, where children are starving and dying, and we live in relative affluence. Of course, he would then follow that up and say, the reason that parable strikes us is because we're there, we see it. But when there's more social distance between us, it doesn't have that same ethical pull on us. But I would encourage you to consider that parable, and I would encourage you to consider why Jesus had Lazarus lying at the rich man's gate. He's right there. Four, it's dangerous to overlay modern economic systems on an ancient text. Some people read the Bible and see capitalism. Some people read the Bible and say socialism, including the text I just recited about the early church. They're selling their possessions and putting it in a common pot. That's communism. That's socialism right there in the church. I think it's dangerous to do that. I don't think the Bible advocates for a single economic system. We want it to. Some people want it to. I think the Bible speaks in many voices. But I do think the Bible is clear about this. No system works without justice. Capitalism doesn't work without justice. Fair rules. Socialism also, by the way. Some of the greatest atrocities in the world are socialist atrocities. No system works without justice. And I think that's what God cares about. And money is in service to our love of neighbor, not love of neighbor in service to our money. When I stand before God and you stand before God, I don't think the question will be, were you a good capitalist? Or were you a good socialist? But maybe the question will be, did you love well? And did that include your money? What you did with your money? Finally, I think avoiding talking about money can lead to sin. And I think Joy was trying to make this point earlier in her observation about the Magnificat. Some people spiritualize all of this, right? And say, God doesn't really care about rich and poor and the gap in between us. God cares about souls. And all of this is spiritualized, right? That, yeah, Jesus said, blessed are the poor, but what he meant was Matthew, blessed are the poor in spirit. But y'all, this is all hard. You got a lot of pushing back to do. So if you don't want to talk about money, I think you're missing something about the gospel. And our evangelical friends love to spiritualize the gospel. And they take all of these sharp edges in Luke and they sand them down to all. God doesn't really care about your money. God cares about your soul. And your money's a byproduct of that. But here, Jesus seems to be saying your money and your soul are linked. They're of one piece. They say something about each other.
Well,
The flip side of that is health and wealth, which says all God cares about is money, right? What salvation means is rich, that there are no poor people anymore. So if you think of a spectrum, a lot of our evangelical friends are way over here saying they're spiritualizing these texts. God doesn't really care about like actual money. And then you have the health and wealth gospel folks over here, which say, if you will just send me $10, I'll send you a prayer cloth and you'll be saved, right? It's not all about money, and it's not about money. It's about the salvation of the whole thing, the whole world and the whole person, right? Does that make sense to y'all? I think that's what Luke is getting at. It's not about money, and it's not all about money. It's about salvation for the whole system. But that has something to say to rich people, and it has something to say to poor people too. Sorry, John, I cut you
Well, I
off.
was going to share real quick. There was a segment on 60 Minutes a number of years ago where the concern on that was about privacy. It was basically access to banking records.
Hmm.
And they just, one of the people who worked for 60 Minutes, they just turned over their bank records, just check ledger basically, to this private detective. And he was able to tell just reams of information that was absolutely correct about this person, knowing nothing about them except what he saw in their check ledger,
Mhm.
how they spent their money.
Yeah.
We don't use check ledgers anymore.
I know, but yeah,
It's an old segment.
but I'm just saying,
Online account statement.
you know, if somebody accessed your financial records and they didn't know anything else about you,
Mhm.
what would those bank records tell them?
Yeah.
About the kind of person.
Oh,
kind of like.
Amazon knows so much more about me than that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, but just the, Jesus' statement, I mean, where
Where your
treasure
treasure is.
is, your heart will be also.
That's right.
It's just, it does, and, the number one thing that people fight about in marriages, money.
Mhm. That's right.
Who controls the money? Because it says a whole lot about more than just the money.
Mhm. Back to Dina's observation. Power, who has the power in this relationship? Comments, questions? Online folks,
I have a story.
okay?
About 23 years ago, I quit my real job and went into real estate. A single person. You don't make any money until you get a commission.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I was in this little bitty church. That's Rock Creek, about 100 people.
Mhm.
And I could see that poor little preacher was not going to make it if I didn't follow this teaching about tithing.
Hmm.
And I have never missed doing it off the growth. And everything's been fine.
Hmm.
And that's simple,
Mhm.
but it's true for me.
Mhm. Thanks for sharing that. I do think there's
But I'm here
reasons.
now and I haven't quit.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There are reasons why we give in worship. That's what I was trying to say a couple of weeks ago. And I worry that all of our online giving has robbed us of this wisdom. I think we give in worship to save our souls. And I don't mean that in a, unless you give to the church, you're going to hell kind of way. That's been done throughout Christian history from time to time. What I do mean is, I think opening our hands and giving, cultivating the habit of giving is a way of saving our souls. It's a way of keeping my humanity, of you keeping your humanity, of us being community together. In the last 2 weeks, funds that you have given to this church kept a man off the streets and in his apartment. Kevin did a beautiful job working networks. But also it wouldn't have happened without gifts from this church to keep someone off the streets. And just this week, we cut $1,000 check and sent it to CBF Mississippi for all the stuff in Jackson at the moment. Small things won't make the news. $1,000 in Jackson is going to go real quick. But it is a way of participating in our salvation. And I don't say that lightly, because I think that's the way Luke says it. Online people. What have I missed? What do y'all want to add tonight? Y'all been typing.
We have been typing a lot.
Money is only as worthwhile as your intentions.
I have the reading that we did with the Jewish leaders that Jesus warns them about, walking around with their flowing robes and being up front and everything. That just, I had not seen that picture before of how much they were just wallowing in what their position and their money gave them, and said, look at me, look at me. And that's just so sad, because they turn around and it's gone.
That's right.
Preston, the thing that really stood out to me about that verse, that latter verse in Luke, was the bivalent nature of it, how it's put in terms of here are the people that want to make a show, and the ones that want to say, hey, look at me, I'm really religious, and then looking at the other end of the spectrum at the poor widow. I'd never really read those two in concert, but I think you have to, and that chapter break definitely kind of disrupts that a little bit. But when you do that, it really, I think, it really evens out the story and really makes a big point, I think.
Absolutely. I couldn't be teaching this class tonight if it weren't for rich people. Can I say that? I received scholarships that let me study in places I never would have been able to study otherwise. And I took that money and learned, and I'm not bad-mouthing rich people. We need rich people. I'll also say to you, I've seen God differently through the lens of poor people. On the streets outside our church. South Africa. India. I have seen poverty, and I've seen people who didn't have a whole lot teach me about a God who has a whole lot. I hope tonight I've prompted some thought and some reflection that will lead us on a path to wisdom. Next week, we're going to take one slender slice of this conversation and talk about taxes. We'll be less biblical next week. We're going to look at one text in particular, but I'm going to try to teach you a little bit about the history of taxation in this country and elsewhere around the world. And we'll talk about the ethics of, are taxes political disagreement, or is that of ethical importance? Is that just a difference of political opinion? Or does that have something to do with salvation? And what's the difference? How do we know? That's what we'll talk about next week.
Preston,
Mhm.
I have just a brief personal story. When I joined second, I was 17. I, was baptized, became a Christian and everything at 17. I knew nothing about a church. I knew nothing about anything, religion or anything, frankly. And, anyway, I was living with my daddy and my stepmother here in Little Rock, and she had been baptized in a little creek called Promised Land, but she was baptized again the week before I was. She wanted to do it again,
To get it
Anyway, about 2 weeks after I had joined the church, she came in my room and she handed me this envelope. I didn't know what it was, what it was for. She said, I was getting $5 a week allowance. I was in college and that was my allowance. And she said, you are to put 50 cents in this envelope, every Sunday. That's your tithe. And I'm about as good at math as you are. You might be a little bit better than me, but I thought to myself, well, hey, I get $4.50. That's a pretty good deal. I can give 50 cents. And that's just kind of stuck with me. It's always been in my mind. It's kind of how I sort of think of it, and it's just easy to give for me when I think of it like that.
I think you've cultivated the habit of giving things away. Sorry I went over tonight, but that's partly y'all's fault. I'm just kidding.